Number 1. The Spiro Mound. In the autumn of 1935, a crew of hired diggers pushed a tunnel into a grassy, earthen mound in eastern Oklahoma and broke through into a hollow chamber that no living person had ever seen. The air inside was stale and still. Their lamps fell on stacked human bones, engraved shell cups, sheets of hammered copper, and baskets that had not rotted, because the collapse of the old cedar burial house had sealed a pocket of dry air around the dead. This was the Craig Mound at Spiro, and the men standing in it did not work for a museum. They worked for the Puckalay Mining Company, and they had leased the right to dig for treasure. Spiro sits on the Arkansas River in Leflore County. It was a Caddoan Mississippian ceremonial center, active from around 800 to 1450 of the Common Era, and at its height, it was one of the most important religious and trading places on the continent. Of its 12 mounds, the Craig Mound was the only great burial mound, and inside it lay generations of the honored dead, laid down with objects gathered from half of North America. There was marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and pearls by the thousand. The engraved art, falcon dancers, weeping eyes, and severed heads belongs to what scholars call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, the shared religion of the Mississippian world. The diggers did not treat it as sacred. In 1935, they used dynamite to open the last resistant fill, and the blast shattered fragile artifacts and flung human remains across the spoil. What survived was sold to private collectors and dealers, and much of it left the state, and some left the country, before any trained archaeologist could record where it had come from. Newspapers called it a King Tut tomb in Oklahoma, which was exactly the wrong lesson to draw. Historians tell 3 overlapping stories about what Spiro was. The mainstream reading is that the Craig Mound was an elite mortuary, a place where rank was displayed in death. A closely related view treats it as the central shrine of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a religious capital. And there is a strand of pure folklore, the so-called Spiro curse, which claims the looters met ruin afterward. That last one is modern legend, not fact, but it survives because people sense that something had been violated. The real horror is not supernatural. A civilization kept an archive of its own dead and its own art for centuries, and it was gutted in a matter of months so the contents could sit on collectors' shelves. Oklahoma passed its first antiquities law in 1936, too late for most of it, and salvage teams recovered what they could. Today the human remains fall under federal repatriation law, returning to Caddo and Wichita, descendants the ancestors the dynamite scattered. The site is now the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center, Oklahoma's only publicly accessible archaeological park, and scholars such as James Brown spent careers piecing the scattered material back together from dealers' records and scattered museum lots. The cruelest loss is that the hollow chamber had preserved textiles and basketry almost never seen in the eastern woodlands, organic art that decayed or disappeared into private hands within a few years of being exposed to the air. Number 2. Norris Farms. Number 36. The excavators lifted a single skeleton from the dark Illinois soil and found a triangular stone point still lodged between the ribs, driven in hard enough to stay. Then they found the next one, and the one after that, until the pattern became undeniable. This was a cemetery where a third of the adults had been killed. Norris Farms at number 36 is an Oneota burial ground in the central Illinois River Valley, dated to around 1300 of the Common Era, and excavated in the 1980s ahead of construction. 264 individuals came out of the ground. The wounds on them read like a catalog of prehistoric violence. There are stone points buried in bone. There are blunt fractures across the tops of skulls from clubs. There are fine cut marks circling the skull vault, the unmistakable signature of scalping. Some people were decapitated. Some had hands or limbs removed and carried off as trophies. The most unsettling detail is what happened to the bodies before burial. Many of the bones carry the tooth marks of wolves and dogs and the gnawing of rodents. That means the dead lay out on the landscape, exposed long enough to be scavenged before their own community found them and brought them home to bury. This was not one catastrophic battle. The bioarchaeologist George Milner and his colleagues showed that the victims were the kind of people who would be away from the village, out gathering and hunting, picked off in ambushes again and again over years. Several bodies carry more than one embedded point, the mark of overkill, and some individuals show older healed wounds. meaning they had survived earlier attacks before a later one killed them. There are 3 ways to frame what this site tells us. The mainstream reading is endemic warfare, chronic raiding between groups competing for land and food during a time of nutritional stress. A second reading emphasizes that the scalping and trophy taking were socially sanctioned, a formalized culture of violence rather than random killing. And there is an older assumption, still repeated in popular culture, that large-scale indigenous violence only began after Europeans arrived. Norris Farms refutes that directly because these dead were in the ground long before any European reached the interior. The stakes here are intimate. To walk out of your village to gather food was to risk never coming back, and to risk your body being left in the open for animals. The people of Norris Farms lived under that shadow and still went out and retrieved and buried their dead with care, even when doing so was dangerous. The site remains one of the most cited records of warfare in pre-contact North America, and it is handled today with the consultation of descendant communities. The Oneota here were maize farmers, and the pressure on good bottomland during a stretch of climate stress may have set neighboring groups against one another over years. The dead include men, women, and children, though the victims skew toward those most exposed out on the landscape, and the assemblage is still a benchmark that researchers return to whenever they argue about how common organized violence really was before Columbus. Number 3. Paige Ladson. 8 meters down in a Florida river, in water so dark with tannin that the divers could not see their own hands, a team felt their way across the riverbed while alligators moved somewhere in the green gloom above them. What they brought up rewrote the calendar of the Americas. It was the tusk of a mastodon, and along its surface ran the cut marks of stone tools. Paige Ladson is a sinkhole in the Archeologists River of North Florida. It was first worked in the 1980s and 90s by S. David Webb and James Dunbar, and then again from 2012 to 2014 by Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters. In a securely dated layer, they recovered the cut-marked tusk together with a stone knife, a biface shaped by human hands. Radiocarbon dating placed that layer at about 14,550 years before the present. That is roughly 1,500 years older than the Clovis culture, which for most of the 20th century was believed to mark the very first Americans. Here's where the story turns, because for decades the idea that anyone predated Clovis was close to heresy in American archaeology. A date like this one, from a clean underwater layer that could not easily be dismissed, was a hammer against that orthodoxy. The cut marks on the tusk are consistent with people working it loose from the skull, probably to reach the soft, nutritious tissue at its base. Analysis of dung fungus in the sediment cores tracked the slow decline of the great animals, and showed that humans and megafauna shared this landscape for more than 2,000 years before the giants vanished. 3 interpretations sit around the find. The mainstream view now is that Paige Ladson is solid evidence of a pre-Clovis human presence in the southeast. The older view, Clovis first, held that no one was here before about 13,000 years ago, and that view has now largely collapsed under sites like this. A fringe of researchers argues for far greater antiquity still, tens of thousands of years, but that remains unsupported by the kind of clean evidence Paige Ladson provides. What preserved all of this was the airless underwater sediment, which kept organic material intact, and the careful mapping of the layers, which ruled out any mixing of old and young material. The stakes are simple and enormous. On the drowned floor of an old sinkhole, in water most people would never dare to enter, lay the receipts that push back the arrival of human beings on 2 continents by a millennium and a half. The mastodon remains are now curated by the Florida Museum of Natural History, a quiet home for a find that broke a rule. Michael Waters of Texas. A&M, one of the central figures in pre-Clovis research, has argued that finds like this one show a people already spread across the continent long before Clovis points appeared. The excavation itself was a feat of underwater archaeology, using airlift dredging and digital mapping to record each layer without destroying the fragile context in water no one could see through. Number 4. Slack Farm. On a cold morning in 1987, a Kentucky field looked as though it had been shelled. The ground was cratered with more than 450 holes, and scattered among the clods of dirt were broken pots and human bones tossed aside by men who had been looking for something to sell. This was Slack Farm, and the photographs of it would help change American law. The farm sits in Union County, near where the Ohio River meets the Wabash. Beneath it lay a large late Mississippian village and cemetery of the Caborn-Wellborn culture, occupied from about 1450 to 1650 of the Common Era. That date range is precious to archaeologists because it spans the very moment when indigenous societies of the interior were beginning to feel the distant shock of European arrival. In 1987, 10 men paid the landowner about $10,000 for the right to dig, and then they went at the cemetery with a tractor, tearing open grave after grave to reach saleable pottery and tossing the bones of the dead out of their way. When word got out, the outrage was national. A prominent magazine article carried the images across the country, and the desecration became a symbol. The men were arrested and charged under a Kentucky law against disturbing graves, but the legal outcome was only at the level of a misdemeanor, which exposed how weak the existing protections really were. Archaeologist Cheryl Ann Munson led the documentation of the damage and the salvage of what remained. There are 3 ways people framed what happened at Slack Farm. To the diggers, this was arrowhead hunting, a hobby they had a paid right to pursue on private land. To archaeologists and to native nations, it was grave robbing, an act of cultural violence against ancestors. And underneath both sat a genuine legal collision between property rights and the protection of heritage, a conflict that American law had never squarely resolved. Slack Farm resolved it, or at least forced the issue. The destruction of a rare proto-historic site, the exact kind of place that could have illuminated the collapse of these societies after contact, produced enough public fury to feed the momentum behind the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passed in 1990. The stakes were hundreds of ancestors ripped from the earth for pottery, and the lasting result was that the country was finally forced to admit this was robbery, not a pastime. The site is protected under stricter modern statutes now, and descendant nations pressed for the reburial of the dead the looters had scattered. Number 5. The Emeryville Shellmound. In 1924, a steam shovel bit into a hill of shell and ash on the east shore of San Francisco Bay, and as the machine tore it apart, the workers recorded roughly 700 human burials coming out of the ground. The hill was not natural. It was a monument built by human hands over thousands of years, and it was being leveled for real estate. The Emeryville Shellmound was one of about 425 shell mounds that once ringed San Francisco Bay, raised by the ancestors of the Ohlone people. This one was among the largest, reported at over 60 feet high, a dense accumulation of shell, ash, tools, and hundreds of the dead, built up across at least 2,500 years and probably far longer. It was a village, a cemetery, and a landmark all at once. The indignities came in layers. In the late 1800s, a dance pavilion and an amusement park called Shellmound Park were built directly on top of it, so that people danced above the graves. In 1902, the German archaeologist Max Uli excavated the mound for the University of California, in what became a pioneering piece of stratigraphic archaeology in North America, and a few years later, Nels Nelson walked the shoreline and cataloged all 425 mounds. Then, in 1924, the mound was largely destroyed. Afterward, the site held a paint and chemical factory, which left the ground poisoned. And in the late 1990s and 2000s, it was redeveloped into a shopping mall. Salvage archaeology during that construction again struck Ohlone human remains. 3 attitudes collided on this one patch of ground. The scientific view treats a shell mound as a midden and a mortuary, an archive of diet and daily life. The Ohlone view is that it was a sacred monument and a resting place. And there was the industrial era attitude, that it was merely a heap of refuse, a mindset that made the bulldozing feel acceptable to the people doing it. Many of the bay's other mounds were simply mined for road fill and erased. The stakes aren't visible every day. Shoppers now park and walk over the burial ground of a people who lived on this bay for millennia. And Ohlone activists, such as Karina Gould, have spent years insisting the dead beneath the pavement not be forgotten, holding observances at the site. The collections from Ula's dig are held at the University of California's Hearst Museum, and repatriation claims for the ancestral remains continue under federal law. The Bay shell mounds together form one of the densest records of indigenous life anywhere in California, and studies of shell chemistry and radiocarbon from them reconstruct thousands of years of diet and rising sea levels. Nearby, the West Berkeley shell mound became a major preservation battle of its own in recent years. As descendants fought to keep another sacred mound from being paved, a city was built on the dead, and the dead are still there. Number 6. On Your Knees Cave. In 1996, scientists crawling through a limestone cave in southeast Alaska turned their lamps on the floor and found a human jaw lying among the bones of brown bears. The bones were scattered because after this man died more than 10,000 years ago, the bears had scavenged him. The site, cataloged as 49 PET 408, lies on Prince of Wales Island, and the human remains were found during paleontological work by E. James Dixon and Timothy Heaton. The remains belong to a young adult male dated to about 10,300 years before the present. Around him, the cave preserved a deep record of animal life: brown and black bear, seal, fox, and fish, spanning tens of thousands of years because this island had served as a refuge through the last ice age. The chemistry of his bones told a startling story. Isotope analysis showed that he ate a diet based on the sea, on seals, and fish and shoreline food, which makes him among the earliest direct evidence anywhere in the Americas of people adapted to a maritime life. That fits the coastal migration model, the idea that the first Americans moved south along a rich shoreline of kelp forests rather than only through an inland corridor. Stone tools in the cave, including obsidian carried from distant sources, showed he was part of a mobile, connected world. What sets this discovery apart is not only the bones, but the way they were handled. The excavators worked in close partnership with the Tlingit tribes of Klawok and Craig, who agreed to genetic study and gave the man a name, Shuka Ka, which means man ahead of us. A study in 2008 placed his mitochondrial lineage in a rare group associated with the coastal migration, and a full genome study in 2017 tied him directly to indigenous people still living in the region today. After the science was done, the tribes reburied him. The interpretations divide along the old routes into the Americas. The mainstream reading now favors a coastal entry, which this maritime man supports. An older model favored an interior, ice-free corridor through the continent. And a fringe proposes trans-Pacific origins, which the genetics do not support. The stakes are almost unbearable in their intimacy. Here was a man eaten by bears 100 centuries ago, and his DNA still runs in the veins of people who live on that same coast. Throughout, the work was governed by federal law and by the wishes of his descendants, and it has become a model for how ancient human remains can be studied with consent rather than seized. The deep sequence of bear and seal bones in the cave documents the last glacial refuge on the island, a pocket of life that survived while ice smothered much of the north. His seafood diet at 10,300 years ago stands among the earliest signs anywhere of people who lived by the ocean. And it reframed Southeast Alaska as an early highway into the Americas rather than a frozen wall. Number 7. The Anzick Burial. In 1968, a loader scraping earth near the small town of Wilsall, Montana, exposed a scatter of stone and bone tools, and mixed among them were the fragile bones of an infant, stained deep red. The red was ochre, deliberately applied, and the child had been buried with more than 100 objects. This was the only Clovis burial ever found. The Anzick site takes its name from the family whose land it lay on. The infant, known to science as Anzick No. 1, dates to roughly 12,700 to 12,900 years ago, squarely within the Clovis period, the era of the fluted spear points that hunters used across Ice Age North America. More than 100 stone and antler artifacts accompanied the child, many of them coated in red ochre, and the ochre lay on the infant's bones as well. This was not a casual disposal. It was a ceremony, and some of the tools appear to have been older heirlooms placed with the body. For decades, the deepest question about Clovis was who these people actually were, and to whom they were related. In 2014, a team led by Morten Rasmussen and Eske Villerslev sequenced the genome of the Anzick infant and published it in a major journal. The result was decisive. This child was ancestral to a large majority of present-day Native American peoples, and especially to populations across Central and South America. In one stroke, the genome refuted the so-called Solutrean hypothesis. The fringe claimed that Clovis technology had come from Ice Age Europe across the Atlantic. The DNA pointed the other way, back through Beringia. There are 3 lenses on Anzick. The mainstream reading is that this is a Beringian descended Clovis child who anchors the ancestry of the first peoples. The Solutrean claim of a European Atlantic crossing is the fringe view, and the DNA does not support it. And there is the interpretation of the burial itself, the ochre and the heirloom tools marking status, grief, and belief. The child is thought to have been a boy, only about 12 to 18 months old when he died, and one of the scientists involved, Sarah Anzick, was a molecular biologist from the very family whose land held the grave. In 2014, after the genetic work, Montana tribes reburied him with ceremony. The stakes are almost too large to hold. There is the private grief of a family 13,000 years ago burying a baby in red, and there is the staggering fact that this one small child's blood reaches nearly every indigenous nation south of the ice. The tools placed with him show the sophistication of Clovis stone working, and the burial connects the deep archaeology of the Ice Age directly to the living communities who chose thousands of years later to lay the child back into the earth. Red ochre burials are known across the ancient world as markers of ritual and care, and this one is the oldest in North America. Number 8. Marmes Rockshelter. In February of 1969, water rose out of the ground and swallowed one of the oldest human sites in America, only months after the United States government had honored it as a national treasure. Archaeologists could only watch as the reservoir crept up through the soil and drowned their trench. Marmes Rockshelter sits in the lower Palouse River Canyon in southeastern Washington, near where the Palouse joins the Snake River. Washington State University's Richard Daugherty began digging there in 1962, and the site yielded some of the oldest human remains then known in the Pacific Northwest, quickly nicknamed Marmes Man. The early deposits held fragmentary and cremated human bone dated to around 10,000 to 11,000 years and more, along with bone needles, tools, and distinctive projectile points, recording more than 10,000 years of people using this shelter. The discoveries were a national sensation. In 1968, the site was declared a National Historic Landmark, and it was prominent enough that even President Lyndon Johnson took note of it. But Marmes lay inside the future reservoir pool of the Lower Monumental Dam, a project of the Army Corps of Engineers on the Snake River. Here is the cruel turn. Rather than lose the site, engineers hastily built a protective levee meant to hold the water back and keep the shelter dry. The levee was supposed to save it. Instead, when the reservoir filled, groundwater simply seeped underneath and up through the earth, and within months of being named a landmark, Marmes was underwater. The site and the trench vanished beneath water and sediment, and the excavation was over. There are competing accounts of the disaster. One is engineering failure, seepage that no one had properly modeled. Another is a policy account that a development project steamrolled an irreplaceable piece of heritage. And a third is a salvage account of archaeologists in a losing race against a filling reservoir, saving what they could before the water arrived. All 3 are true at once. The stakes are painful and clear. A place had just been recognized as irreplaceable, and then it was deliberately put underwater, becoming a monument to what large dams cost. The loss of Marmes helped push the country towards stronger laws protecting cultural resources so that future projects would at least have to reckon with what they might drown. The collections are curated by Washington State University, and the tribes whose ancestors used the canyon are consulted on their care. The site itself remains where it fell silent beneath the reservoir. Number 9. Old Vero Man. In 1915, a Florida geologist lifted human bones out of the earth and found them lying in the same layer as the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths, animals that had been extinct for thousands of years. If he was right about what he was seeing, then people had lived in Florida far earlier than almost anyone was willing to believe. The place is the old Vero site at Vero Beach in Indian River County. The geologist was Elias Sellards, and his excavation set off one of the fiercest early debates about human antiquity in the Americas. Sellards insisted the human remains were contemporaneous with the extinct beasts buried in the same ancient deposit. But the towering authority of the age, Alish Hrdlicka of the Smithsonian, dismissed the claim, arguing that the human bones must be recent intrusions that had worked their way down into older layers. Hrdlicka's prestige was so great that his verdict effectively buried the Vero claim for decades. The story did not end there. Beginning in 2014, a new committee reopened excavations at Old Vero, applying modern dating methods such as optically stimulated luminescence alongside radiocarbon. And there was a second, stranger discovery connected to the area. A fossil bone, likely from a mammoth or mastodon, was found to carry an incised image on its surface, the simple engraved figure of a walking, long-trunked animal, a proboscidean. If that engraving is genuinely ancient, it would be among the very oldest known artworks in the Americas, perhaps 13,000 years old or more. Researchers, including Barbara Purdy, examined the bone in 2011, using microscopy and rare earth element testing, and concluded the engraving was consistent with genuine ancient work rather than a modern fake. Skeptics remain, questioning whether the incisions are truly as old as the bone. Three positions hold the ground. The cautious mainstream allows that the engraving may be authentic early art, and that Vero's humans may be genuinely ancient. The historical position is Hrdlicka's dismissal, the confident authority that shut the question down. And the skeptical fringe holds that the engraving is an elaborate later forgery. The stakes are twofold. There is the possibility of a human hand drawing a living mammoth, a portrait of the Ice Age by someone who watched it walk. And there is the sobering lesson of how the authority of a single powerful scientist can bury a real discovery for a generation. The Vero fossils had accumulated in an old wetland deposit, mingling human and animal remains, and the modern committee has worked to constrain the layers with careful dating rather than with reputation alone. The whole episode has become a case study in how science corrects itself slowly, and in how one confident dismissal can cost a discovery decades of recognition. Number 10. The Paisley Caves. In a dry cave in the high desert of southern Oregon, a researcher's gloved hands lifted something small and unglamorous from the dust, a preserved piece of ancient human waste, and inside it lay the oldest human DNA yet found in the hemisphere. The least dignified thing a body leaves behind became the proof of who was here first. The Paisley 5-Mile Point Caves sit in the northern Great Basin, and the excavations were led by Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon in the 2000s. The arid conditions had preserved desiccated human coprolites, fossilized feces in the protected cave deposits. Radiocarbon dating placed some of them at about 14,300 years before the present. When ancient DNA was extracted, it matched Native American maternal lineages, the mitochondrial groups labeled A2 and B2. This was the oldest directly dated human genetic evidence in all of the Americas, and like Page Ladson, it was older than Clovis by more than 1,000 years. Then came the fight that nearly sank it. The first report, published in the journal Science in 2008 by Thomas Gilbert, Dennis Jenkins, and their colleagues, was met with a hard question. Could modern DNA or urine and water percolating down through the deposit have contaminated the samples and faked an ancient result? It was a serious challenge, and the team answered it with a follow-up study in 2012, again in Science, that supported the ancient human origin of the material. There is more at Paisley than the coprolites. The caves also produced western-stemmed projectile points, a stone tool tradition that may be parallel to Clovis, or even older, and that appears to represent a separate technological lineage. That matters because it suggests not everyone in early America descended from Clovis toolmakers. The interpretations line up in 3 rows. The mainstream now accepts Paisley as firm evidence of a pre-Clovis presence. The skeptical position centered on contamination, a concern the follow-up work addressed. And a technological reading emphasizes the Western stem tradition as a distinct non-Clovis strand of the peopling of the continent. The stakes are almost funny and entirely serious at once. The proof of the first Americans came not from a golden artifact, but from what they left in a latrine, preserved by dry desert air. Paisley, together with Page Ladson, Meadowcroft, and Monteverde in Chile, now anchors the modern consensus that people were here before Clovis. The dry sagebrush and rimrock environment gave a level of organic preservation that almost no open site can match, and the Team Cross checked multiple coprolites and their associated materials to be sure the dates truly held. Improved ancient DNA methods continue to be applied at the caves, and each new result has reinforced rather than weakened the original claim. Number 11. Meadowcroft Rockshelter. Beneath a massive sandstone overhang in southwestern Pennsylvania, an archaeologist stood at the bottom of 11 banded layers of earth, holding a radiocarbon date that was not supposed to be possible. It said people had been here around 16,000 years ago, thousands of years before the rulebook allowed, and that single number would start a war that lasted decades. Meadowcroft Rockshelter is in Washington County, and James Adivasio began excavating it in 1973. It is one of the deepest stratified archaeological sequences in the Americas, with 11 natural strata recording roughly 16,000 years of intermittent human use, one of the longest occupation records on the continent. The lowest cultural levels produced radiocarbon dates around 16,000 years before the present, and some readings ran even older, toward 19,000. In the 1970s, when Clovis first was gospel and no one was supposed to predate about 13,000 years ago, these numbers were close to scandalous. The attack came fast. Critics argued that the radiocarbon samples might be contaminated by ancient carbon, by particles of coal, or dissolved humic material in the groundwater, which could make young material appear far older than it was. Adivasio and his colleagues defended the dates fiercely, pointing to the rigor of the excavation and the clean, unmixed stratigraphy visible in the walls of the dig. The early levels yielded a distinctive blade technology, including what became known as the Miller Point, along with plant remains, animal bone, and fire features layered across the millennia. This dating war did not resolve overnight, but Meadowcroft anticipated the moment in 1997 when the site of Monteverde in Chile was finally accepted as genuinely pre-Clovis, and the whole orthodoxy began to give way. Modern consensus increasingly favors a pre-Clovis peopling of the Americas, which vindicates the core of what Adivasio had argued for years. The three positions still echo. The mainstream now grants that pre-Clovis dates are plausible, and that Meadowcroft may well be that old. The skeptical position holds that coal carbon contamination inflated the ages, and a middle view accepts that the dates are probably real while debating exactly what the earliest levels mean. The stakes reach far beyond one quiet Appalachian overhang. A single stratified shelter forced an entire field to admit that its confident story of when America was first peopled had been wrong. Meadowcroft is now a public museum and a national historic landmark, and it remains one of the most scrutinized sites in the country. Adivasio is also a leading authority on the perishable technologies of prehistory, the basketry, and textiles that almost never survive. And he brought that meticulous eye to every layer of the dig. Meadowcroft, together with sites like Cactus Hill in Virginia, forms the backbone of the Eastern evidence for a human presence in the Americas before Clovis. Set these 11 discoveries side by side, and a pattern rises out of the ground. There are really two kinds of horror at work. There is the horror of what was found, the massacre cemetery, the scavenged man in the bear cave, the infant buried in red. And there is the horror of how the finds were treated, the dynamite at Spiro, the tractor at Slack Farm, the paint factory, and the mall on the Emeryville dead, the reservoir led up over Marmes. Again and again, the deepest damage was done not by time but by us. Several threads run straight through the list. One is the long fight over when people first reached the Americas. Page Ladson, Paisley, and Meadowcroft, from a Florida sinkhole to an Oregon cave to a Pennsylvania overhang, together dismantled the decades-old belief that Clovis hunters were first. Another thread is desecration for profit, for hobby, for industry, and even by government engineering, each of which erased records that can never be recovered. A third thread is genetics, because Anzick, On Your Knees Cave, and Paisley now tie the ancient dead directly, by DNA, to living native nations. The ethics changed underneath all of it. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 marked a shift from treating the dead as specimens to be collected toward treating them as ancestors to be consulted, and often reburied. The land itself is the lesson. The ground you walk, the field, the riverbed, the bay shore, is an archive crowded with the buried, and much of the American present sits directly on top of it. The ground is not finished with us. The single largest open question is still the oldest one. Exactly how early were the first Americans? 16,000 years, 20,000, or more? Some of the best answers may lie underwater, on the drowned coastlines, and continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age and are now submerged and almost entirely unmapped, holding the earliest evidence just out of reach. New methods keep reopening cases that once seemed closed. Ancient DNA pulled straight from cave sediment, sharper dating techniques, and non-destructive imaging are all forcing archaeologists to revisit sites they thought they understood. At the same time, the relationship between excavation and descendant communities will increasingly shape what is dug at all and what is left in peace. Stand back far enough and the awe arrives. Every construction trench, every sinkhole, every dark cave mouth is a potential doorway into 14,000 years and more of human presence on this continent. America's deep past is not an empty prehistory waiting to be filled. It is crowded, it is intimate, and it is still speaking. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.